If you ever want to see a man's real face, watch him when he thinks he's already won. The words hovered somewhere between memory and prophecy as Elena Hart stood behind the velvet rope at the edge of the press conference. Her fingers curled around the smooth leather strap of her purse like it was the last steady thing in the room, and beyond the bright wall of camera lights Ryan Cole looked taller than she remembered, broader somehow, as if success itself had added inches to his frame. His navy suit cut, so precisely it seemed engineered rather than tailored, his voice amplified through sleek microphones that glowed red like tiny warning signals. He didn't see her at first, and for one suspended second, she almost believed she could slip away unnoticed, dissolve back into the quiet corners of the life she had built around him. But then he said her name, not tenderly, not cruelly, just clinically, as if it were a line item on a spreadsheet he had decided to eliminate, and the room shifted. Reporters leaning forward, phones lifting, the low hum of whispered curiosity, swelling into something sharper, something hungry, while he explained in polished, careful sentences that their marriage had reached its natural conclusion, that ambition demanded sacrifice, that some people were meant to stand in the spotlight, and others were meant to support from the shadows. The marble floor beneath her heels felt suddenly colder than December wind off the Hudson, and she became aware of the chandelier overhead scattering gold light across the stage, like confetti thrown for someone else's victory, aware of the scent of expensive cologne drifting through the air, aware of the thin, invisible thread of dignity she was clinging to with every measured breath. And when the applause came, it was polite and corporate, a sound without warmth, a sound that confirmed what she already knew, that in this world silence could be more brutal than any accusation. She watched him accept handshakes, watched him smile for photographs, watched the woman in a crimson blazer slip her arm through his as if she had always belonged there. And something inside Elena did not break the way it had the first time he dismissed her dreams over breakfast, or the night he stayed late at the office until sunrise. Something inside her simply went still, like the surface of a deep lake when the storm finally passes. She stepped forward then, not to interrupt, not to protest, only to return the ring he had once slid onto her finger beneath summer fireworks on a rooftop in Brooklyn. And as she placed it on the edge of the podium, it caught the light for a fraction of a second before rolling across the cool stone and coming to rest near his cufflink. A small bright circle that seemed to hold the echo of every promise they had ever made. Ryan glanced down, surprised, more by the disruption of his perfect script than by the loss itself. And when he finally met her eyes, there was a flicker of recognition followed by something else, something that looked dangerously close to relief, as if he believed this moment marked the end of her story rather than the beginning, as if he could not imagine the quiet mathematics of reinvention already unfolding behind her steady gaze. Outside the glass walls of the building, Manhattan traffic moved in restless streams, yellow cabs slicing through dusk, neon signs blinking awake one by one. And Elena walked past the rows of luxury sedans without looking back, the autumn air sharp in her lungs, the city stretching out before her like an unclaimed future measured not in miles, but in possibilities she had been too loyal to see until now. And somewhere deep within that newly carved silence, a single thought took shape with the clarity of steel, that the world he had chosen over her was also the world she would learn to master, not for revenge, not for spectacle, but because freedom, she realized, had a sound, and tonight it was the steady rhythm of her heels against the sidewalk as she disappeared into the crowd. Winter arrived in New York like a whispered challenge, and Elena Hart accepted it without ceremony, trading silk gowns for structured coats and late-night galas for early-morning commutes measured in crowded subway stops, and the distant metallic sigh of trains echoing through tunnels beneath the city. Her reflection in the dark window of the downtown platform looking less like a fallen socialite and more like a strategist quietly studying the battlefield she had once feared. She found work in a modest investment consultancy tucked between a coffee shop and a dry cleaner on Madison Avenue, the kind of place no glossy magazine ever photographed, where fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead and the scent of burnt espresso clung to the air like stubborn memories. And at first no one knew who she had been, only who she chose to become, a woman who listened more than she spoke and observed the invisible currents of power flowing through balance sheets and boardroom rumors with a patience that felt almost meditative. Days unfolded in precise rhythms, 12-hour stretches filled with spreadsheets, conference calls, and the quiet thrill of learning to decode ambition itself, while nights were spent in a one-bedroom apartment barely 700 square feet wide, its windows overlooking a narrow alley where snow gathered in delicate ridges like folded paper, and there she rediscovered pieces of herself she had set aside during the years of being someone else's support system. Sketching business models in the margins of old notebooks, reading biographies of leaders who had built empires from rejection, and cooking simple meals while jazz music drifted through the dimly lit room like a promise she had not yet fully understood. Sometimes she would pass a television in a bar window and catch a glimpse of Ryan's confident smile flashing across financial news segments, hear commentators praising his expansion strategies and relentless vision, and a flicker of the past would tighten around her ribs before dissolving into something steadier, something sharper, because she no longer saw him as the center of her story but as a case study in the cost of certainty. It was during one rain-soaked afternoon, the kind that blurred skyscrapers into watercolor silhouettes, that her supervisor, a silver-haired woman named Margaret Hale with eyes that missed nothing, paused beside her desk and asked a single question that felt like an unlocked door. What would you do if you had the power to rewrite the market instead of just analyzing it? And Elena's answer came without hesitation. I would learn how to become invisible first, then indispensable, a response that earned a rare approving nod and the subtle shift of opportunity that followed like sunlight breaking through cloud cover. Months passed and whispers began to circulate through industry circles about an anonymous strategist whose insights were quietly altering the trajectory of struggling firms. Deals that once seemed impossible now unfolding with elegant precision, and Elena moved through this new landscape with the calm confidence of someone who had finally stopped asking for permission to exist, measuring progress not in applause but in influence, not in headlines, but in the subtle satisfaction of watching structures change because she had dared to imagine them differently. By spring, the city smelled of thawing pavement and possibility, cherry blossoms scattering along Park Avenue like fragments of a softer world. And as she stepped into a sleek black car, sent by a client who insisted on meeting somewhere above the skyline, Elena felt the past recede another measured mile behind her. Unaware that far across town Ryan Cole was studying a series of unexpected losses with growing unease. Sensing the presence of a rival he could not name, a quiet force moving through his empire like wine through glass towers, reshaping the future one calculated decision at a time. Summer rose over Manhattan in waves of heat that shimmered against glass towers and asphalt avenues, and Elena Hart felt the city breathe differently now, as if it had finally begun to recognize her presence even when her name remained absent from headlines. Her days unfolding in sleek conference rooms 40 and 50 floors above the restless hum of traffic where panoramic windows framed the Hudson like a moving mirror, and executives leaned closer when she spoke, sensing the quiet authority in her measured tone. The transformation had not arrived with fanfare, but with a sequence of precise victories. Acquisitions structured like chess moves, negotiations conducted in calm voices that never needed to rise, and slowly the modest consultancy that once hid her from the world evolved into a powerful investment consortium that operated behind a veil of discretion, its success attributed to market intuition, while Elena orchestrated strategies that reshaped entire sectors, her tailored suits, replacing the borrowed confidence she had once worn beside Ryan. Her reflection now steady and self-possessed beneath the glow of modern chandeliers that cast geometric patterns across polished marble floors. Rumors of an emerging conglomerate began circulating through financial newsrooms and late-night business podcasts, a rival entity expanding with deliberate grace into territories Ryan Cole had long considered his own. And he followed the developments with a tightening jaw and an unease he could not articulate, watching stock prices dip in ways that felt personal, as if the market itself were questioning his certainty, his boardroom meetings growing sharper edged, his laughter less frequent as quarterly reports revealed patterns he could not predict. One humid August morning, he stood in his corner office overlooking Central Park, the skyline rising like a jagged crown beyond the trees, and studied a confidential memo detailing the latest threat, a pending merger that would shift billions of dollars and alter the balance of power across the industry. The rival consortium's leadership still shrouded in anonymity, yet moving with the confidence of someone who understood his strategies before he announced them. And for the first time since the day Elena walked away from the press conference, he felt the faintest echo of something he had dismissed as weakness, the unsettling realization that the past could return not as regret, but as competition. Across town, Elena stepped from a black sedan onto the granite steps of a historic financial building where American flags rippled against a bright blue sky, her heels striking the stone with a steady rhythm that matched her pulse. Assistants greeting her with quiet deference as she entered a private elevator that rose smoothly toward a boardroom prepared for one decisive vote. Sunlight flooding the corridor ahead like a spotlight she no longer feared. And as she paused outside the double doors, she allowed herself a single measured breath, aware that somewhere within the labyrinth of glass and ambition Ryan Cole was also preparing for this confrontation without yet knowing the identity of the force that had challenged him at every turn. Unaware that the woman he once believed too gentle for his world had spent seasons learning its language, rewriting its rules, and that when those doors opened the future would tilt in ways neither of them could ever fully control. The double doors opened with a quiet hydraulic sigh that seemed far too gentle for a moment capable of altering entire fortunes, and Elena Hart stepped into the boardroom as though she had always belonged there. The late summer sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows and catching the subtle sheen of her tailored charcoal suit. The long table polished to a mirror finish where reflections of suited executives shimmered like uncertain ghosts. She felt their attention settle on her with the weight of expectation and curiosity, the air tinged with the faint scent of leather portfolios and freshly brewed coffee, and for a fleeting instant the memory of another room, another life, flickered across her mind before dissolving into the calm focus she had cultivated over the past year. A focus built from early mornings, strategic risks, and the quiet refusal to remain invisible any longer. She took her seat at the head of the table, acknowledging the murmured greetings of board members who had come to trust her judgment without fully knowing her story. And as the presentation began, a digital screen illuminated graphs that rose and fell like tidal currents. Numbers translating ambition into measurable impact while she spoke with a clarity that drew every eye toward her, outlining a merger that would consolidate resources, expand influence, and quietly place her consortium in direct competition with the empire Ryan Cole had spent a decade constructing. Across the city, he was entering his own conference room, a space lined with panoramic views of Midtown where the skylines stretched toward the horizon in confident steel lines, his advisors briefing him on unexpected market shifts and the anonymous strategist whose moves continued to disrupt his projections, his expression composed, but his thoughts tightening into questions he could not answer. And somewhere beneath his polished certainty a recognition began to stir, the sense that the opponent he faced understood not only his business model, but his mindset, as though she had once stood close enough to hear the cadence of his ambitions in the quiet moments between success and sleep. Back in Elena's boardroom, the discussion intensified, voices layering over one another in cautious enthusiasm and measured concern. Yet she remained steady, guiding the conversation with a subtle authority that felt less like dominance and more like inevitability, her gaze occasionally drifting toward the city beyond the glass where taxis glided along sunlit avenues and pedestrians moved with purposeful urgency. Reminders that life continued regardless of corporate triumphs or defeats. When the time came for the preliminary vote, she folded her hands on the table and allowed a brief silence to settle, the kind that sharpens attention and reveals unspoken doubts. And in that stillness, she realized how far she had traveled from the woman who once measured her worth through another person's approval, how the seasons of anonymity had reshaped her into someone who could command a room without raising her voice, someone who could transform uncertainty into opportunity with the quiet precision of a well-placed decision. Hundreds of yards away, Ryan paused mid-sentence as a notification flashed across his tablet announcing the rival consortium's decisive advance, his pulse quickening in a way he could not fully explain, while Elena met the eyes of each board member in turn and felt the future pivot on a single collective breath, the path ahead opening like a door she had built herself, one calculated step at a time. The final votes appeared on the illuminated screen one by one like constellations forming a new sky, each quiet affirmation sealing a decision that would ripple through markets and headlines long before the sun set beyond the Hudson. And Elena Hart felt the subtle shift of power settle into place not with triumph, but with a calm, almost solemn clarity, as if she were witnessing the completion of a long equation whose solution had always existed just beyond the reach of fear. The boardroom exhaled collectively, chairs sliding back against polished wood, low conversations sparking into life as advisors calculated outcomes and assistants stepped forward with neatly organized documents. Yet she remained still for a moment at the head of the table, watching the city beyond the glass where summer haze softened the outlines of skyscrapers and ferries moved across the water like patient thoughts. And in that suspended second, she allowed herself to remember the woman she had once been, standing beneath chandeliers as someone else dictated the rhythm of her days, believing that love required quiet surrender instead of mutual strength. Across town, Ryan Cole studied the same market reports now transformed into undeniable reality. The rival consortium's name finally revealed in bold digital letters that glowed against his tablet screen, his pulse steady, yet charged with a tension he could no longer dismiss. His advisors speaking in measured tones about strategy and response while he focused on the unfamiliar signature at the bottom of the document, Elena Hart, a name that carried both memory and revelation. And for the first time he understood that the invisible force challenging his empire had never been a stranger, but a reflection of his own past choices moving toward him with relentless precision. Elena rose gracefully, acknowledging congratulations with composed nods, her voice warm yet reserved as she outlined the next phase of negotiations, the room gradually emptying until only the quiet hum of the air conditioning remained. And when she finally stepped into the private elevator, she caught her reflection in the mirrored walls, seeing not a ghost of former expectations, but a woman who had learned to transform uncertainty into purpose, her eyes steady with the knowledge that success was not a destination but a landscape she would continue to shape. The car descended smoothly toward the lobby where sunlight filtered through revolving doors, and a line of black vehicles waited along the curb, like punctuation marks in a story still unfolding. And as she walked into the bright afternoon, a gentle breeze lifted strands of her hair, carrying with it the distant sounds of traffic and laughter, and the endless motion of a city that rewarded those who dared to reinvent themselves. Unaware that only a few blocks away Ryan was stepping into his own waiting sedan, determined to confront the rival he had underestimated, their paths drawing closer with every passing minute, like parallel lines finally destined to intersect, the future gathering momentum. In the charged silence between what had been lost and what was about to be claimed, evening settled over Manhattan in a slow wash of amber light that reflected off glass facades like molten gold. And Elena Hart watched the skyline from the back seat of her car as it carried her downtown toward a reception she could not avoid, a gathering of investors and executives hosted in a historic hotel whose marble lobby still whispered of old fortunes and quiet rivalries. The air inside scented with polished wood and citrus cologne as she stepped through revolving doors that turned like the gears of destiny, her heels measuring the distance across a mosaic floor that glowed beneath crystal chandeliers. Conversations softened when she entered the ballroom, not out of fear but out of recognition, because her reputation now preceded her like a subtle tide reshaping the shoreline of influence. And she moved through clusters of tailored suits and shimmering gowns with composed warmth, accepting handshakes, answering questions, all the while sensing a current beneath the surface, an anticipation she could not quite name. Across the room Ryan Cole arrived moments later, his presence drawing its own circle of attention. Yet tonight his confidence felt edged with curiosity, his gaze scanning faces until it paused on hers with the sudden stillness of a clock stopping mid-tick, the music from a string quartet drifting between them like a bridge suspended over years of silence. And for an instant the noise of the reception faded into a distant hum as recognition settled into his expression, not shock exactly, but a dawning comprehension that the rival he had pursued through contracts and negotiations had always been someone who knew the architecture of his ambitions by heart. Elena felt the weight of that moment without flinching, her pulse steady as she met his eyes across the room, remembering the echo of marble floors and press cameras and the way her name had once sounded like an afterthought in his carefully measured voice. And now here they stood beneath chandeliers once more, yet everything had changed, the symmetry of the past rearranged into a future neither of them had rehearsed. He approached with deliberate calm, the crowd parting in subtle waves as though instinctively acknowledging the gravity of their convergence. And when he finally stopped a few feet away, the distance felt both immeasurable and surprisingly fragile, like the thin glass walls that separated boardrooms from the restless city beyond. For a heartbeat neither spoke, the quiet between them filled with the distant clink of crystal glasses and the murmur of deals unfolding in corners of the room, until Ryan offered a faint, incredulous smile that did not quite reach his eyes, and said her name as if testing its reality. While Elena responded with the same composed grace she had practiced in countless negotiations, her voice warm yet resolute as she acknowledged him not as a memory, but as a competitor standing on equal ground. Somewhere a waiter passed with a tray of champagne flutes catching the light like small stars, and as they turned slightly toward a balcony overlooking the river, the summer air brushed their faces with the promise of change. Both of them aware that the conversation about to begin would not simply revisit what had been lost, but determine what could still be built from the ruins of expectation. The city below glittering with possibility as the first true confrontation of their new lives finally drew breath. The balcony overlooked a river that shimmered under the deep blue hush of evening, its slow current catching fragments of city light like scattered memories, and Elena's heart rested her fingertips lightly against the cool glass railing as she listened to Ryan Cole speak in a voice carefully balanced. Between confidence and uncertainty, the familiar cadence stirring echoes of a life she had once inhabited yet no longer claimed. Below them traffic moved in steady ribbons of red and white, the distant hum of engines rising and falling like the breathing of an enormous creature. And for a moment neither of them acknowledged the reception continuing behind them, the muted laughter and clinking crystal dissolving into the background, as if the city itself had drawn a quiet circle around their conversation. Ryan studied her with an intensity that felt less like accusation and more like reluctant admiration, asking questions that revealed both surprise and a subtle respect for the path she had forged, while Elena answered with composed clarity, choosing each word with the same precision she applied to corporate strategy, aware that every sentence carried the weight of history as well as the promise of transformation. She spoke of long mornings spent learning to read markets like maps, of hidden terrain, of mentors who had challenged her to claim space in rooms she once feared, and of the realization that influence could be built not through spectacle, but through quiet persistence. Her voice steady even as the wind lifted strands of her hair and carried the distant sound of a saxophone drifting from a late-night bar across the avenue. Ryan listened without interruption, the glow of city lights reflecting in his eyes like unspoken calculations, and when he finally admitted that he had underestimated her strength, the confession seemed to alter the air between them, not softening it, but making it clearer, more honest, like a window finally opened after years of being sealed shut. Elena felt a flicker of something unexpected then, not triumph and not regret, but a calm acknowledgement that their shared past had shaped them both in ways neither could fully escape, that ambition had once driven them apart, and now stood as the only language they truly spoke in common. A server stepped onto the balcony with a silver tray of champagne flutes that sparkled like fragments of starlight, and as Ryan accepted one and offered it to her, she hesitated for only a heartbeat before taking the glass, the delicate chime of crystal against crystal sounding almost ceremonial, a quiet recognition that the rivalry unfolding between them was no longer personal but profoundly consequential. The conversation shifted toward strategy, toward the looming merger that would redefine their industries, and as they spoke the night deepened around them, Manhattan glowing with restless possibility, while the river carried reflections toward the horizon like messages no one could fully decipher. Both of them aware that the next decisions they made would not simply determine market share or corporate power, but reveal whether the distance they had traveled since that long-ago press conference had been a journey toward conflict or an unexpected convergence of purpose. The night unfolded like a carefully composed symphony as Elena Hart and Ryan Cole remained on the balcony long after the music inside had softened into a distant echo, their conversation weaving through strategy and memory with a precision that felt almost inevitable, the city lights stretching around them in glittering constellations, while a warm breeze carried the scent of summer rain rising from pavement far below. Elena felt the subtle tension of possibility gathering between every measured sentence, aware that the rivalry defining their present was rooted not only in ambition, but in the fragile truth of who they had once been to one another. And as Ryan spoke about the merger with a mixture of caution and curiosity, she recognized the familiar spark of determination in his eyes, the same restless drive that had once inspired her and later forced her to redefine herself beyond its shadow. He described the mounting pressure from investors, the sense that unseen forces were reshaping the landscape faster than he could predict, and she listened with calm attention, offering insights that neither conceded advantage nor concealed respect, her voice steady against the murmur of the river, as if the flow of water itself echoed the rhythm of her thoughts. Somewhere inside the ballroom, a burst of laughter rose and faded, a reminder that life continued in parallel to the quiet drama unfolding above the city. And Elena wondered briefly whether the world would ever understand the complexity of this moment. Two people standing at the intersection of past affection and present competition, each aware that the decisions ahead would define not only their industries, but their identities. Ryan's expression softened in the glow of the skyline as he admitted that he had begun to question the certainty that once guided his every move. That success achieved without balance now felt less like triumph and more like a challenge to find meaning beyond numbers and headlines. And Elena felt a flicker of empathy she had not anticipated, realizing that transformation was rarely a solitary journey even when it appeared that way from the outside. She spoke then of purpose rather than victory, of building something that could endure beyond market cycles and fleeting recognition. Her words, shaped by months of reflection and the quiet resilience she had cultivated in rooms where no one knew her story. And as she finished, a distant rumble of thunder rolled across the sky like a promise of change, lightning briefly illuminating the river in silver flashes that seemed to suspend time itself. They stood together in that charged silence, champagne glasses forgotten on the railing, both aware that the next chapter would unfold not with dramatic declarations, but with deliberate choices made in boardrooms and quiet offices across the city. Choices that would test whether ambition could coexist with integrity and whether the distance they had traveled since their separation had brought them closer to conflict or to a new understanding neither of them had yet dared to imagine. Rain began as a fine silver mist drifting across the river, and the balcony lights shimmered through it like distant stars. And Elena Hart felt the shift in the night as clearly as she felt the steady rhythm of her own breathing, the city around them softening into reflections and shadow, while Ryan Cole leaned against the glass railing with a thoughtful stillness that seemed almost unfamiliar on him, his confidence no longer loud but deliberate, as if he had begun to measure success in quieter terms. The storm gathered slowly over Manhattan, thunder rolling like an approaching decision, and inside the ballroom the orchestra had transitioned to a slower melody that floated outward through open doors, wrapping the moment in an unexpected tenderness neither of them had planned, yet neither could deny. Elena watched the first drops of rain trace delicate paths across the polished stone floor and remembered the countless mornings she had risen before sunrise to study financial models in a dimly lit apartment, the way she had taught herself to interpret market signals like a second language, and how each calculated risk had felt less like rebellion and more like the simple act of reclaiming her own narrative. Ryan spoke then with a candor that surprised even him, admitting that the rivalry between their companies had begun to feel less like competition and more like a dialogue, each move from one side inspiring innovation from the other, a dynamic that forced both of them to evolve faster than they ever had alone. And Elena recognized the truth in his words, sensing that the path ahead might demand collaboration rather than conquest, a possibility as unsettling as it was compelling. Lightning flared briefly across the sky, illuminating the water below in flashes of pale brilliance, and in that fleeting brightness she saw the outline of the future as something fluid and unpredictable, shaped by choices yet to be made in conference rooms and quiet conversations far from public view. The rain intensified, tapping softly against the balcony railing like a steady pulse, and they moved closer to the doorway not out of fear, but out of instinct. The warmth of the ballroom lights drawing them back toward a world of expectations and strategy. Yet the conversation continued in hushed tones that carried an undercurrent of understanding neither had anticipated when the evening began. Elena felt the weight of opportunity pressing gently against her resolve, aware that the merger negotiations would soon demand definitive positions, alliances formed or broken with consequences measured in billions of dollars and reputations built over decades. While Ryan's gaze held a question he had not yet spoken aloud, a silent acknowledgement that the woman he once thought he understood had become a force capable of reshaping his destiny as surely as her own. Beyond the windows, taxis splashed through rain-slicked streets and neon signs flickered in wavering reflections, the city alive with motion and promise. And as the music swelled inside the ballroom, Elena realized that the rivalry defining their present might also hold the key to a future neither of them had imagined. A future where ambition could become a bridge instead of a barrier, if only they dared to trust the uncertain rhythm guiding them forward. Morning arrived in a pale wash of silver light that softened the sharp angles of Manhattan's skyline, and Elena Hart stood beside the floor-to-ceiling windows of her office watching the city awaken with its usual quiet urgency. Yellow taxis threading through avenues still damp from the night's rain, while sunlight caught on glass towers like a promise waiting to be claimed. The conversation on the balcony had lingered in her thoughts like the echo of distant music, shaping the decisions she would soon need to make as reports spread across her desk in neat, deliberate rows, each page outlining the next phase of negotiations that would determine whether the rivalry between her consortium and Ryan Cole's company would escalate into open confrontation or transform into an unprecedented alliance. She moved through the morning with calm efficiency, meeting with analysts who spoke in confident numbers and strategic forecasts, her voice steady as she asked questions that revealed both caution and vision, aware that influence was no longer something she sought, but something she carried naturally, like a current flowing beneath the surface of every choice. Across the city, Ryan faced a similar horizon of decisions, his office bathed in golden light that painted long shadows across the polished floor as he studied market trends and the subtle shifts in investor sentiment that now seemed to revolve around Elena's growing reputation, the realization settling within him that the woman he once believed too quiet for his world had become the only person capable of challenging his certainty with equal resolve. As the day unfolded, their paths converged once more, this time not in the charged intimacy of a balcony, but in the measured formality of a conference room overlooking the river, where representatives from both sides gathered around a table that gleamed with possibility and risk, the air carrying the faint scent of fresh coffee and anticipation. Elena entered with composed assurance, acknowledging Ryan with a brief nod that spoke of recognition rather than nostalgia, and when discussions began, the conversation moved with the controlled intensity of a chess match played at the highest stakes, proposals unfolding like calculated steps, each response shaped by the knowledge that compromise could build something stronger than victory alone. Outside, ferries carved white lines through the blue expanse of water while sunlight scattered across waves in fleeting flashes, a reminder that momentum belonged to those who dared to navigate uncertainty. And as hours passed, the tension in the room shifted from guarded rivalry to cautious collaboration, voices softening, ideas aligning in unexpected harmony. Elena felt a quiet clarity take hold as she realized that the journey from rejection to reinvention had led her not merely to compete, but to redefine what success might mean, while Ryan watched her with an expression that held both respect and a dawning humility, understanding that the future they were shaping together would demand more courage than any solitary triumph. The skyline beyond the windows standing silent witness to a turning point neither of them could fully predict, yet both sensed would change everything. The afternoon sun drifted westward in long golden angles that stretched across the conference room floor like quiet reminders of time, moving forward whether decisions were made or delayed. And Elena Hart felt the subtle shift in energy as negotiations entered a deeper, more revealing phase, the polite structure of corporate dialogue gradually giving way to something more personal, more consequential, as if the walls of glass surrounding them had begun to dissolve into the larger landscape of possibility waiting beyond. Spreadsheets and projections lay scattered like maps of uncertain terrain. Yet the true focus of the room was no longer on numbers alone, but on the unspoken recognition that two distinct visions for the future were slowly converging, shaping a strategy neither company had imagined until now. Ryan Cole leaned forward with an expression that held both determination and reflection, his voice measured as he proposed terms that balanced risk with innovation, acknowledging, without overt sentiment, that Elena's insight had already altered the direction of his thinking in ways he could not ignore, and she listened with the same composed attentiveness she had cultivated during the long months of rebuilding herself, weighing each suggestion not as a response to their shared history, but as a step towards something larger than either of them alone. Outside the windows, the river moved in steady currents beneath a sky brushed with pale clouds, ferries tracing graceful arcs between burrows while sunlight flickered on the surface like scattered signals of change. And Elena realized that the future unfolding before her felt less like a destination and more like a living conversation, one that required courage not only to lead, but to trust. Hours passed in concentrated focus, coffee cups replaced by glasses of water, tension softening into a collaborative rhythm that surprised even the most seasoned advisors seated along the table, their expressions shifting from skepticism to cautious optimism as frameworks for partnership began to take shape. Ryan paused at one point to look directly at Elena, his gaze steady and unguarded in a way she had rarely seen before, and in that silent exchange she sensed an acknowledgement of growth on both sides. The understanding that ambition once used as a shield could also become a bridge if wielded with clarity and respect. When the final draft of their preliminary agreement appeared on the screen, it glowed with understated significance, a document that would not merely influence market positions, but redefine the narrative of their connection. And Elena felt a quiet resolve settle within her as she considered the path she had traveled from anonymity to authority, from heartbreak to vision. She rose then, moving toward the window for a brief moment of solitude, watching clouds drift above the skyline, while traffic pulsed below like the heartbeat of an ever-evolving city. And as she turned back toward the table, she understood that this was no longer about proving her strength or reclaiming lost dignity. It was about shaping a future where resilience and purpose could coexist without compromise, a realization that carried both gravity and unexpected hope. As the meeting reached its decisive threshold, the sky above Manhattan shifted into a deep burnished gold as late afternoon faded toward evening. And Elena Hart felt the atmosphere in the conference room transform with the same quiet inevitability as the changing light outside the glass, the final pages of the agreement resting on the polished table like a promise waiting to be claimed, each signature line a threshold between the uncertainty of the past and the possibility of something unprecedented. The discussion had grown softer in tone, yet heavier in meaning. Advisors speaking in measured voices about integration timelines and long-term projections, while Elena remained composed at the head of the table, aware that the true significance of this moment could not be calculated in quarterly returns or market share, but in the courage it took to choose collaboration over rivalry, growth over pride. Ryan Cole stood near the window studying the skyline with an expression that revealed both resolve and reflection. The city lights, beginning to flicker on one by one like silent witnesses to a turning point neither of them had anticipated when their paths first diverged. And when he turned back toward her, there was a quiet understanding in his gaze that spoke more clearly than any formal statement, an acknowledgement that the journey from separation to confrontation had ultimately led them to a shared horizon neither could reach alone. Elena felt the weight of her own transformation settle gently within her, memories of long solitary nights and uncertain mornings blending with the present clarity of purpose she now carried with ease, her voice steady as she outlined the final strategic vision that would unite their resources and reshape the landscape they once fought to dominate. The room listening not only to her words but to the confidence that had been forged through resilience and self-belief. Outside the windows, the river reflected streaks of orange and violet as the sun dipped below the skyline. Fairies gliding through shimmering water, while distant horns echoed like a slow heartbeat. And in that luminous stillness, Elena realized that the future she was helping to create felt less like a victory and more like a liberation, a chance to redefine ambition as something expansive rather than isolating. The first signature was placed on the document with a soft, deliberate motion that seemed to echo through the quiet room, followed by others in careful succession until the agreement lay complete before them, its presence both tangible and symbolic, a testament to the unexpected convergence of two lives shaped by challenge and reinvention. As colleagues began to exchange restrained smiles and subdued congratulations, Elena rose and moved toward the window once more, watching the city transition fully into night, while reflections of light shimmered across the glass like fragments of a new beginning. And when Ryan joined her at her side, there was no need for grand declarations or dramatic gestures, only a shared awareness that the choices they had made would ripple outward into countless unseen futures. Their partnership now defined not by what had once been lost, but by what they had chosen together to build. Weeks later, autumn returned to Manhattan with a clarity that sharpened every skyline silhouette and painted the trees along the avenues in shades of amber and crimson. And Elena Hart stood alone on the terrace outside her new office, watching sunlight spill across the river like liquid gold, the steady rhythm of the city below sounding less like noise and more like affirmation. A reminder that reinvention was never a single moment, but a sequence of choices made with quiet conviction. The partnership she and Ryan Cole had forged was already reshaping industries, their combined strategies setting new standards for innovation, while analysts speculated about the unexpected alliance that had replaced rivalry with vision. Yet for Elena, the true transformation was more personal, a deep calm that settled into her spirit each morning as she moved through glass corridors and conference rooms, not as someone seeking validation, but as someone who had finally claimed her own narrative. She recalled the day she had once walked away from a life defined by another person's ambition, the echo of marble floors beneath her steps, the weight of uncertainty pressing against her resolve, and she allowed herself a brief smile at the realization that every setback had been a hidden invitation to discover strength she had not known she possessed. Ryan joined her on the terrace with a quiet familiarity that spoke of mutual respect rather than dependence, his presence no longer a reminder of past fractures, but a testament to growth. And together they watched fairies glide across the water while the skyline shimmered under a sky so blue it felt almost symbolic, a horizon wide enough to contain both memory and possibility. Their conversation was light, yet purposeful, touching on upcoming ventures and long-term goals. Yet beneath each exchange lay an unspoken acknowledgement that the journey they had shared had redefined not only their professional paths, but their understanding of resilience and connection, ambition no longer a force that divided, but a current that propelled them towards something larger than individual success. As the sun began its slow descent, Elena felt a sense of completion settle around her like the gentle hush that follows applause. Not because the story had ended, but because she had reached a place where peace and purpose could coexist without conflict. And in that stillness, she understood that true empowerment was not found in revenge or recognition, but in the quiet certainty of knowing she had become exactly who she was meant to be. The wind carried the distant sound of traffic and laughter from the streets below, life continuing in all its unpredictable brilliance. And as she turned back toward the glass doors leading to her office, she paused for one final glance at the river reflecting the fading light, aware that every ending was also a beginning, and that the world would keep moving forward, just as she would, guided not by the need to prove her worth, but by the enduring confidence she had built step by measured step.